Welcome to Her Success Matters, a podcast exploring how advisors can work together to build a pathway for women to succeed in financial services. I am your host, Christine Shaw, Chief Executive Officer of Investment News. This podcast will give you rare insider access to the top financial services executives who are taking action to break down the barriers for the next generation of female advisors. You will also hear from some amazing and inspiring women who have forged their own pathway to success. Welcome to Her Success Matters. Today I'm thrilled to sit down with Corie Pauling, TIAA, Teachers Insurance and Annuities Association's Chief Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Officer and Head of Corporate Social Responsibility. In this role, Corie oversees TIAA's Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Strategy. Corie also leads an expanded diversity, inclusion, and equity team that includes the Enterprise Workforce Planning and Analytics Group. Corie was also a civil rights attorney and has always been committed to elevating the voices of the unheard and the undervalued. TIAA is a Fortune 500 leading financial services firm in academic, research, medical, cultural, and governmental fields. Corie, we're so thrilled to have you join us today. Welcome to Her Success Matters.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here.
So let's start our conversation today with learning a little bit more about you. Would you please tell our listeners about your upbringing and how that has shaped your career today?
I'd be glad to. I still pause when I'm asked a question like that because in so many respects, I feel like I'm still on a journey and learning every day. It's my hope that some aspects of what I've experienced and perhaps some of the impact that I've had on people's lives helps motivate or inspire others. But I still smile a bit because I do feel very much like the young girl who grew up on the east side of Detroit, spending a lot of time with my grandmother, learning from her, being nurtured by her, one of the very first people to tell me that I was smart and taught me the love of math and puzzles, Scrabble, and the wisdom of our elders. I instilled that young girl in many respects and find the work that I do today to just be an opportunity for me to pass on what I learned in those days. Growing up in a very blue-collar city, a majority African-American community, I grew up in the majority. I went to public schools, also went to a small Lutheran middle school. Detroit has a very rich immigrant history, but by the time of my coming along, and it certainly in my community, was largely Black. And what that did for me was a very special affirmation of who I am as a Black woman. It helped me have a certain confidence about possibilities, about inclusion, about my being enough. It helped reinforce important messages for me about my intelligence, my capability, even about beauty, which for women still resonates in a way that I think we're actively working on. In my childhood, though, those were all the parts of what I call a non-monetary rich environment that helped me be the first person in my family to get a college degree, and there'd be no question as to whether I was going to college. It also helped me in how I connect with my now teenage daughters. I have two. I think I learned as a child that I was surrounded by walking American history, people who were brilliant and successful, who had overcome tremendous challenges and were living very quietly powerful lives and raising their families. My grandparents migrated during the Great Migration in the 1940s from rural Mississippi to Detroit with a stop in Dayton with the idea of getting one of those factory jobs in the auto industry. Everyone in my family worked in the auto industry, very much a community where people worked in one place for 30, 40 years, got a pension, and lived some years of retirement. But there was not a lot of talk about stock and investing and mutual funds and the sort of savvy that really does help provide the beginning of generational wealth. With that said, they did the very best they could. And I think there were so many people who had such rich stories to share that we just don't know. I feel very fortunate that surrounding me throughout the course of my life growing up in Detroit, I had the great benefit of learning from many such people. Really proud of my Detroit heritage. It's a big part of who I am. I think it's a big part of my personal constitution in wanting to make sure that the unheard voices are listened to, that those that we don't think about as our go-to actually can be the go-to. And some of the work that I've done as a lawyer along the way as well, we've continued to reinforce that early lesson. So that's a bit about me and my childhood. I'm grateful for the wisdom and the teaching that was part of who I am from my earliest memory.
I love that. And thank you for sharing so much about your background. I think an important thing you said at the very beginning of the conversation is you said you smile because it's like a journey and you're still on it. And I think that's the most important thing for everyone to understand, that we are all still on a journey. If you think about everything this past year has taught us and continues to teach us. I mean, we're all sitting here waiting for the outcome of the George Floyd trial, and that has the ability to change so much in this world. So just acknowledging and recognizing that no matter how much we've learned along the way, you have to have an open, flexible mind and continue the path of growth and learning. So I think that's important. But also talking about your stories, and from playing puzzles and Scrabble, which is one of my favorite, by the way, to do with my children, with your grandmother. I love a good Scrabble competition. And it's interesting. I think that in today's day of social media, computers, and technology, you forget about those simple things. You can really spend hours in a nice game of Scrabble with no distractions. And that's such a great thing to do. So I encourage a lot of people to do that sort of thing, especially with your children and with family. It's fantastic learning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really is. And it's learning. I mean, it's puzzles. You're learning geometry. You're learning sort of analytics. You are thinking on your feet. There's so many subtleties to some of the most, I guess today would be viewed as really old-fashioned games.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that last year allowed people to rediscover some of those things through quiet moments that would not have happened but for the fact that we were all at home and may still be at home. I will add, though, that my grandmother and I also watched soap operas. So not everything we did was was that educational, but perhaps that prepared me too. I don't know.
No, but you need balance, right? It's all about balance. Actually, that pivots to another comment I wanted to pick up on, is that you are able to have that confidence, and being told you're beautiful is so important too, because beauty comes in all different skin tones, colors, shapes, sizes, and women just need to hear that, and people in general, that you're beautiful, and to believe that and know that, and to have someone help you understand that along the way. That's another really strong message, especially to young girls and women as they grow up. So I love that you had that balance of everything from playing games to watching soap operas and learning about confidence and beauty at a young age. Really important.
That's right. Now, I would say that today I am concerned about the barrage of images that young girls receive through social media about what is beautiful. It is not as inclusive as it ought to be, and one would expect we would have made more progress by now. I think just the constant aspect of that, though, is what is different. Growing up, I wasn't always looking at other people on videos or selfies or TikTok. Yeah, there were mirrors and things like that, but it wasn't so in your face all of the time. And there wasn't this focus on hair and makeup and eyebrows and all these things, lashes and things that I see really consuming young girls from an early age. So I do think some more progress needs to be done. The reality, though, is that this idea of external beauty still tends to have a major place in how we regard ourselves. I think we have to do better than that. I say to my children always have heard me always lead with me telling them, like my grandmother told me, that they're smart. I've also brainwashed them that they love math. They both say that math is their favorite course. It's because I've made them believe that. And in fact, I think that has influenced how well they've done. We have to be very conscious about those messages for young girls in particular, and for young boys in some respect. But for me, I do think that affirmation was an important part of confidence building. I grew up in an environment that was predominantly Black. There was reinforcement for what I looked like all around me. It wasn't until I went to college that I experienced what it felt like to, for the first time, question hairstyles or eye color, whatever the various attributes are. I did not have really any exposure to that until I was going to school. So I actually am happy about that, because I didn't grow up questioning those things in a way that can be hurtful.
There was a documentary that a lot of us are aware of and maybe you've watched on the social dilemma around social media and the impact it has in particular on teenagers for the reasons you stated.
I did see that.
Yeah, so it's something to be mindful of. I actually applaud Dove. They were one of the first companies to come out with a much better campaign around featuring realistic visions or images of women of all different looks and sizes and making people feel beautiful. But I agree that the intelligence is important too. And there's so many components to one's characteristics and feeling of self-confidence. It's not just what's on the outside, it's all of it. And it sounds like you were brought up in a very great home environment that encouraged that, allowed for that, and you're transferring that onto your young teenage daughters as well. So that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Sure, I am trying to.
Yeah, we all have to do our part, right? And that's the whole thing, is we all just have to continue on the journey and learn and make the changes and steps in the right direction to make it a place where everyone feels that they belong and they're included. So that's a great step into talking about becoming a civil rights attorney. So what led you to that, and how has that helped you shape the way in diversity, inclusion, and equity?
My path to civil rights law was one that involved a certain quiet rebellion for me. It was the first time that I really paused to say to myself, what am I just truly interested in? What do I feel a sense of passion about? What just seems to be right for me? I was an engineering major in college, and there's a long story behind that. I'd always done well in school and math and science, as I've shared. Also had some other influences from my high school sweetheart and things, but found myself attending the University of Michigan in the College of Engineering and ultimately graduating, having done a number of internships. And in fact, after graduation, working as a manufacturing systems engineer for a period of time before I pressed pause and to say, gosh, I really like that business law class that I took as an elective. Maybe I ought to consider law school. I remember, though, that when I was packing up to head to Northwestern for law school, because I had been a consultant, I lived at home after I graduated from undergrad. I was on the road traveling every week and planning to move to Chicago. I was talking to my mother as I was pretty much heading out the door. And as I was leaving, she asked me, "Are you sure about this?" And I remember thinking to myself, Mom, I'm not going to start a rock band. I'm not going to be a rapper. I'm going to law school. My journey through law school really was me trying to responsibly find something that really motivated me at my core. I wasn't going to be one who would just completely abandon a sense of purpose or drive and sort of travel the world. I didn't have the luxury of even thinking about that. I had to do something that would ensure some means. And for me, law school seemed like a good idea. The problem, however, was that I had zero exposure to lawyers growing up. I saw them on TV, but absolutely no exposure to anyone in that profession. Again, I was the first college graduate in my family. In law school, I found myself trending toward the things that engineers who get law degrees do. I had to remind myself that, well, I didn't really want to stick with engineering, so I probably don't want to do what lawyer engineers do. I began to explore, again, through a very interesting story, employment law. As it turned out, one of the professors for whom I did research in law school connected me with another professor who was doing work at Northwestern and at Duke. When I made my way to North Carolina after graduating from law school, that series of connections connected me with a lawyer at a civil rights law firm that was founded by Julius Chambers in the 1960s. It was the first integrated law firm in North Carolina, probably in the region. It's a historic firm that had done literally all of the early landmark employment law, school desegregation, and voting rights cases. That combination of connections that I had connected me with a lawyer there who encouraged me to apply for a role, a position as an associate, and there began my path toward civil rights work. And interestingly, when I had been at Michigan and got my first taste of law through that business law class, it was further reinforced by the death of Thurgood Marshall, which was in, I believe, my senior year of undergrad. So I read his life story, asked myself, how did you get to do that? Lo and behold, through just a series of connections that I'll talk about later, have just been absolutely fundamental to my life course. I found myself doing civil rights work with absolutely no connection to the South, no exposure to lawyering other than my internships in law school at that point, in a firm doing what first gave me some sense that I might have found my calling. Through my decision to move to North Carolina and to take the job with Ferguson Stein, that's the name of the law firm, I grew up as a lawyer with a family that nurtured me in every way possible. I was nurtured as a new Southerner, as a new lawyer, as someone with no family in the area, and had wonderful exposure to just a great diversity of cases and the practice of law that really did embrace the idea that everyone's voice needs to be heard, and that sometimes that voice can only be heard through strong advocacy. We did literally every type of litigation possible, from major class actions to single plaintiff cases. I've represented grieving mothers who lost a child to a police officer's bullet. I've represented, in the course of my career in the early 2000s, families in what were still segregated school districts who were receiving inequitable funding. I have represented sexual harassment plaintiffs, ugly race discrimination cases, public accommodations cases. Really, really fortunate to have had that early exposure, because it really is part of who I am, and set me on a course that I think is an important part of the work that I do today. I know it's an important part of the work that I do today.
I can really hear your personality coming through in the conversation, from how you were raised to your exposure. I love the expression, your quiet rebellion of, hey, I'm not going to I don't want to be an engineer, but rather an attorney. Then to land at a firm that made you feel like you belonged, probably had a big impact on you and your confidence and ability to do the job in an area where you didn't have your biological family with you and you didn't have any connections. But I can tell just from our conversation, you would be an easy person to welcome into an environment, because of you have this quiet, powerful presence about you that,
oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think anyone would want to have part of their team. So what spoke to you about becoming a corporate lawyer and doing in-house representation, and how to help solve some of these issues that you saw as an attorney in a private practice into corporate America?
What I learned over the course of my years in my civil rights practice was that impact and change requires that spirit be everywhere. Meaning that I did make an impact doing the work that we did at my beloved Ferguson Stein Chambers law firm. But I grew to believe that you could also do that from a different side of the table. I made what was the treasonous decision to move away from my individual litigant practice or class action litigant practice to representing corporations. It was difficult. And I think that as we think about this concept of her success matters, one of the things that we have to challenge ourselves to do are a couple of things that I did during that time that I had no idea I was doing it, but reflecting on it now, there is a lesson in that I hope resonates with someone who may be listening. And that is that we have to push ourselves outside of our comfort zones. I had to be willing to move from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Chicago for law school instead of just staying at the University of Michigan and going to law school there, which I was considering, which would probably have landed me back in Detroit right after. Something made me know for some reason that I needed to move. I needed to go to Northwestern and experience Chicago, which is a bigger, more cosmopolitan city. It did afford me exposure to a richer diversity of experiences and food and people and relationships. So something made me know that I needed to do that. Similarly, when I started down the path, the very practical path of combining my engineering degree with lawyering, I could have been an IP lawyer, and I actually interned at an IP firm my first summer. But then I had to remind myself, well, I really didn't want to do that. So why did I just sign up for the easiest road? Something made me say, no, you need to go in another direction. Again, getting outside of that comfort zone and some acceptance of the unknown. And for me, the unfamiliar. And then the decision to move south. There were personal reasons for that move too, no question, but the decision to move to North Carolina from Chicago, again, having no connection to the state, was a bold one that I had no appreciation for in terms of the magnitude of the course of its impact on the course of my life. But again, it was some willingness, unconscious willingness to move into a new direction, having no idea what was going to happen, and just seeing what can come of a potential direction that just seems right. I think so often we make prudent decisions. We are afraid of the unknown. For many very understandable reasons, we are not risk takers. I think a message for me as I reflect on my life, because I wasn't doing this aware of it at the time, but as I reflect on my life now, that series of things that made me be willing to take those steps as they presented are important lessons that I have to remind myself of now as I think about my forward steps. I would say that moving from that civil rights practice and the wonderful environment that was for me to a corporate law practice, while questionable from a principle standpoint for some, it was a difficult day when I shared with my partners that I was leaving to go to a big mega labor and employment law firm, and the reason for that. But I found myself learning that there was an opportunity to have a different form of really significant impact advising companies, because that advice could lead to helping shape the employment experience and therefore the lives of an entire workforce. What I found on the corporate law side was that ability to advise and form these relationships with corporate clients. What I found dissatisfying was litigating in defense of that type of client when in my view, there was an opportunity for the client to do something different or better.
I can understand that perspective. And I want to pick up on one thing you said, though, is that you had to step outside your comfort zone. And I would say one of the things that probably 95% of the guests that I speak to on Her Success Matters have that same commonality, that they had to get a little uncomfortable to get to the next step. And that pivots very well into what you do, which is advocate for an environment that is inclusive, diverse, inclusive, and equitable. Because without that, you don't have the confidence to stay or feel you made the right decision. And you talk about your switch to the firm that you first went to and how they made you feel that you belonged there. And a lot of companies, we talk about it a lot, but it's not really until this past year, I feel that we're actually taking more actions. We're hiring more chief diversity officers. We're hiring more people, training and educating internally on how to make that environment more inclusive, so that if you are that person that steps into a new role or whatever it is, or a new company, that you feel like you belong. So talk about some of the steps that you take as an advocate for this and how we can do that ourselves within our own organizations.
I'm glad to share some thoughts on that. And I actually have to reflect on a couple of things in my civil rights days that are examples of what companies can do today to reinforce a sense of belonging in that person or that colleague that needs it in a certain moment. I remember when I was a younger lawyer, two instances, one where I was mistaken as the wife of my client in federal court by the judge. And my law partner stood up and said, "Judge, this is my law partner, Corie Pauling." In the moment where he had called me Mrs. So-and-so, who was my client, again, my client's last name. And I'm not sure what made him think I wasn't a lawyer and was the wife of the plaintiff, but my law partner, who was older and highly respected, well-known, stood up and said, "Judge, this is my law partner, Corie Pauling." Not in a way that reprimanded him, but definitely sent a message of, she is a lawyer. Please give her that respect. There was another time when I had to advocate for myself. I had a client matter in Western North Carolina in the mountains and had been attempting to negotiate a resolution of the matter with the board attorney in the county. We'd only spoken by phone, so we'd only heard each other's voices. On the day of the hearing that I had requested, because we weren't able to come to a resolution, I drove out in my gray pinstripe suit with my briefcase and met with my client in the lobby of the county building and noted an older white gentleman park and approach the building. I assumed rightly that he was the attorney representing the county. As he approached the two of us, he must have made some assumption that we were the two that would be having the hearing on opposite sides, and we would be doing this hearing on the matter. He extended his hand to my client and said, "Mrs. Pauling." My client was a white woman my age. She had on a sundress with sunflowers on it. Those sunflowers are very vivid in my mind even today. But he looked at the two of us and he extended his hand to her and made the assumption and acted upon the assumption that as between the two of us, she would be Mrs. Pauling and I would have to be the client. So in that moment, I had a couple of choices. I could have either recoiled and got in my feelings, or I could have spoken up and said, "This is my client. I'm happy to introduce you to her. I'm Mrs. Pauling, Corie Pauling. I've been speaking to you on the phone for the last several weeks." It was also important that in that moment that I beat him in the hearing,
Yes.
which I did. So we were victorious in the hearing, and that was also part of what I felt it was my responsibility to do, to help him see his gap, his bias, his behavior, acting upon bias. Those are two stories that I reflect on because in large part, that's what I do at work every day now on a much bigger scale, a global scale, in fact. I help lead inclusion, diversity, and equity for my enterprise. I am in this role now, having been on the employment law side in the law department for 12 and a half years, loving every day. I've really enjoyed in-house work, certainly as compared to corporate law practice. And that's because there was a real ability to see the impact that I was making in terms of making sure that everyone had a fair shot. I can't guarantee outcomes, but I could advise in a way that said, those folks that people don't want to listen to, we're going to have policies and programs and performance standards that make sure, or try to make sure, that everyone has a fair shot. And now that I'm in this role, no longer in law practice specifically, I get to do that in a way that is less restrained by being the lawyer advisor. I get to kind of come up with hopefully great ideas for the organization, new initiatives that speak to some of the current events that we'll talk about in a moment. It's my job to lead the organization in a way that it is focused on providing that fair shot for the young girls from Detroit who were the first college graduate in their families, to every other combination of diverse experiences that we all bring to the table every day when we show up for work. I love my work. I feel very passionate about my work because at its core, it's enabling me to have that impact that is really at its very core who I am and what I was raised to be.
I love that. And thank you for sharing those stories, because I think that we all have some version of a story that really resonates or stays with us. Like you said, you have the vivid images of the sunflowers, and you will never forget that moment as long as you live. And I'm sure that helps you along the way. Also, the fact that you were able to keep your composure and deal with it in a really effective way and powerful way. I think that that says a lot about your character. And it's a good lesson for people listening of how you can do things in a moment that help correct those unconscious bias without it being a major controversial thing. And that was probably more powerful than if you had just read him the riot act or recoiled, right? So
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It's my hope that perhaps he reflected on that and it helped him in his next encounter with a young Black woman, that he wouldn't assume her status or in a comparative way make an assumption about relative power or purpose.
Yeah, let's hope that we make those impacts, those changes, so that people can stop doing that, right? And that's a lot about what we're learning, and we have so much more work to do on it. In terms of specific, let's take the conversation a little bit like outside of work and with family and friends. This is such a topic that's on everyone's mind, especially today as we all are sitting on pins and needles of the outcome of the sequestered jury in the George Floyd case, right? So how do you have those conversations, and how do you make it so the conversation's a productive conversation and doesn't turn into something less than productive or unrest? Can you offer any advice on that?
I can. No one's an expert on this. We're learning as we go. One of the things that 2020 showed us is things will happen that we just cannot anticipate, completely unpredictable, on a scale that no one would have imagined. The entire course of how we live has altered. And as people talk now more and more about post-pandemic, I actually question whether there will truly be a post-pandemic way of living. I think some of the things that we've learned, good and bad, we've gotten really creative at connecting and figuring things out, given the limitations of what the last year and a half have required of us. But I don't know that there will be a true post-pandemic. But one of the things that during this window, and certainly last year, we were challenged to do, and frankly, that I think that the challenges we were trying to manage enabled, is voice. The work that I do in inclusion, diversity, and equity has simply propelled because of the pandemic, because of racial injustice, because of remote work, because of the impact on families. It's not something that anyone would have wished or envisioned or certainly imagined. But boy, have we gotten to a place where people are talking and connecting about things that would have been corporate taboo in a way that is unprecedented in its honesty and authenticity. In some respects, its rawness. We are talking about race. We are talking about gender and other diversity dimensions really, really vulnerably. And I think it has ushered in a point in time that we will reflect on in the decades to come. In our organization, what we decided to do was, in those moments where we didn't know what was around the corner, what we did know is that people needed to be heard, people needed to be served, and people needed to be inspired. For us, particularly as it related to racial injustice and what we all were horrified by last year and are awaiting the appropriate outcome, hopefully today in the trial, was a point in time where, as an organization, people just simply needed to get it out, to talk about things and experiences that they never would have talked about at work or on their teams before. There was enough trauma and pain and demand that the organization had to find that space to allow that to happen. Our CEO, Roger Ferguson, facilitated a call of around 7,000 associates where we came together in early June last year, and it was exceptional in terms of the power of what was shared, not just by my Black colleagues, but also white colleagues, long-serving, newer colleagues. This moment on this Zoom call was absolutely electrifying for creating a sense of community that cascaded throughout our organization through dialogues that took hold for to come. What we did from that moment was create a platform called Be the Change, because what we wanted people to know is that you are here, you belong, we want to hear you, we want to serve you, we want you to be your very best. We also want to challenge you to think about the forward journey and what you and this organization can do to get us in a better space. We mobilized around that very simple premise of Be the Change, which is something that you can rally around. It's something that you can ask yourself as you're turning on your Zoom screen, as you are interacting on a phone call, as you're reading a document, as you may be witnessing someone who is being marginalized in some way on a call or in a meeting or in an email. In ways big and small, the question became, how can we be the change organizationally and individually every day? And that really connected. We had over 30 programs over the course of the year inspired by that concept and focusing specifically and unapologetically on not just racism, but Blacks, and beyond the relationship between Blacks and law enforcement, but what I call those knee on the neck moments in the Black community were not just what George Floyd experienced with the knee on his neck that led to his demise in just a horrifying, dehumanizing way, but also reflected those data points that tell us that there is still tremendous opportunity in the Black community in a number of really significant fundamental life sectors that show that knee on the neck continues from institutionalized racism. And that's whether we're talking about differences in wealth generation, whether we're talking about differences in housing patterns, employment, education, and most assuredly related to the pandemic, healthcare. It was very important, and as part of my strategy in leading inclusion, diversity, and equity for TIAA, that we understand through data what is happening and why the nerve was so collectively hit last year. we lead with data in all that we do, but it was really important that we ground our workforce and our client base in why this moment was such a movement that was going to shape the way in which we engaged at work and in our communities from here on. So Be the Change was the launch of that for us. It remains our platform as we continue the journey forward because it applies to other instances of marginalization and violence, such as what we have observed this year involving our Asian brothers and sisters and non-binary members of a community as well. It's the same message of this may not be what I really understand, but how can I get informed to understand the history of violence against the Asian community? And what can we do as an organization to get to a better space? We can simply be the change. And so that will continue to be the way in which we talk about that pivot in leadership to continue to inspire and encourage others that we are moving in the right direction.
I love that you have a specific program that's comprised of 30, at least minimum programs that all serve the Be the Change mantra and way of operating within TIAA. It does start at leadership, but it goes across all aspects of the organization. And when you talk about the knee on the neck moment, I think you're right. It's like no one can compare everyday instance to what the horrific situation was that we all witnessed, and is so raw and so horrible and hard to watch. But I think that inside there were so many people who could relate to what it felt like to be dehumanized and to really just feel that this is not right. We can't accept it. We cannot sit back and just do nothing. To initiate an initiative such as Be the Change and require that we do lean into this and we learn and we don't just talk about it, but we actually put actions into companies so that we can not only be the change, but we make change happen in a real significant way and a much faster speed than we have done historically.
One of the things that we know is that what we observed in that George Floyd video was just the culmination of many things that had happened over the course of history that just weren't videoed. So by no means was that a new phenomenon. It was just the collective shock of seeing that type of depravity in the treatment of another person. From that came this pivot opportunity to be the change, where we shared vulnerably this collective sense of shock and horror and shame and asked ourselves, what are we going to do about it? And the answer for us was and is that TIAA will lead the charge to be the change.
And I think it helps that this lesson that this learning we're hearing from what you've done should help other people listening think, what can we do? What can we do? What action can we take? How can we make change within our own organizations that help employees and people all over the world? Thank you for sharing. I can't believe it's already almost an hour has gone by. So that's bringing us to the end of our conversation. And Corie, what I always do is end these sessions asking my guests one question, which is, in your words, please tell our listeners why you believe her success matters.
That is a powerful question. I love it. Her success matters because the strength and power of women is something that we have in us that is emerging in profound ways. Within our organization, we are welcoming our new CEO, Jashonda Brown-Duckett, in just a couple of weeks. She is a wonderful business leader, very experienced, long record of impact, committed advocate, powerful personality, all the things that you want to see in a new generation of leadership for a 100-year-old organization. Her success matters, and I'm committed to her success. I want her to be successful because she is something that my daughters will see and be inspired by, and that we should all see and be inspired by. It's a fact that women have the ability to carry life, to give life, to feed life, to nurture life. That's simply remarkable. That's not just in the biological sense. We have the capacity, it is in us to lift each other, because I think when we do that, we lift the world. Her success matters because her voice is one that isn't always heard. We have to create the spaces for that to be heard, because when that voice is heard, then that's when business innovation occurs, whether it's new products, whether it's new client opportunities, whether it's new markets. When her voice speaks, given her experiences, that's when we can go in new directions. As I think about those times when, I was assumed to be the wife of a client, or the client when I was the lawyer, when my voice was requested, that's when change happened. That's when unconscious bias was challenged and recognized. We have to be those advocates for each other, because I think when our voices are heard, that's when we are moving really and truly toward the greater good. That's when change is happening. So we have that capacity really to inspire that focus on being the change.
Well, I, for one, after hearing more about you, your background, and your upbringing, am so glad that you had that moment of quiet rebellion while walking out the door and said, this is really what I'm meant to do, because you're having such an impact, and the work you're doing is amazing. And I don't know your two young teenage daughters, but boy, am I excited for them, because if you are their mother, then the sky's the limit for both these young ladies. And I will follow you on social media and hopefully learn to see what they end up growing up to be, because I think they're going to be amazing, because you're such a great role model.
Well, that means so much to me. Thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you, Corie, for sharing so much with our listeners and our audience. I've learned a lot from this conversation. I appreciate you. And if you could just tell people the best way to follow you on social media.
Certainly. I am on LinkedIn. Just look me up. Corie Pauling, CoriePauling. I do a fair bit of social media posts through LinkedIn, and we'll be expanding soon to other channels.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Her Success Matters, a podcast brought to you by Investment News, where we believe her success matters. This is just one of our many initiatives that we have to support women in finance. You can follow us on Spotify or Apple, and please rate us or give us your opinion or feedback. And don't forget, if you know an amazing woman whose story needs to be heard, please reach out and let us know. You can find me on LinkedIn at Christine A. Shaw. Thank you.
The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Investment News. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service providers with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.